So you guys read chapters 1 and 2 with Miss Osborne the other day. I'm going to quickly go through a couple things I want you to know about those chapters before we go on to chapter 3. So voices off, phones down. You guys will have time at the end to do what you need to do. Okay, so chapter 1 was mainly about Victor's childhood. Now remember, Victor is Victor Frankenstein. He's telling his story to Walton, the guy from the ship. Victor was the guy who's says his life is over, he's stranded in the ocean, he's dying, he says there's no more chance for him. He's telling his story, so this is the beginning. He talks about his childhood, and his childhood sounds very idealistic. He talks about being sheltered and loving and all this family around him. It just sounds wonderful, okay, which is interesting because we know where he ends up. You know, we know where he ends up in tragedy. And then he meets, so his parents have a friend, Buford. Buford falls into a deep depression and he dies. So Victor's parents adopt a little girl named Elizabeth. You guys remember reading about Elizabeth? She's this, they call her this beautiful little girl. They adopt her, only instead of those two being brother and sister, Victor and the girl Elizabeth, they want them to get married someday, which to me is a little weird, but it's back in the day and they did things weird back in the day. So they're raised as siblings, but they're meant to get married in the long run. Okay, and then the second chapter talks about his education. Does anybody remember how Victor Frankenstein was educated? What? Self-taught. He was self-taught. Now, this is interesting to me because personally, I have some very weird ideas about education, although they are backed in science, and that most learning should be self-taught. I think teachers are very unnecessary for the most part, which I know is weird to say as a teacher, but truly if you guys were able to and left to learn what you were interested in, you could teach yourself. You can't necessarily teach yourself stuff like what the test wants you to know about what the author thinks about this book. Who cares anyway? But the thing is if you needed to know something, to do something you were interested in, you would teach yourself. How did you learn to walk? How did you learn to talk? How did you learn to ride a bike or play or do all that stuff? I mean, yeah, maybe someone helped you a little bit ride the bike, but you had to do it. You had to pretty much teach yourself how to balance and do all that stuff. So he says he's self-taught. He says being self-taught gave him the opportunity to learn things that he wanted to learn. He wanted to learn how to speak Latin, so he taught himself to speak Latin. Now, if he were to be forced into a classroom like this and made to learn Latin when he wasn't interested in it, anyone who's taken a foreign language in high school knows that's hard. Like, to do it because someone else is making you do it for no other reason, it changes everything. Something that if there's something you're interested in, maybe art, writing, music, math, you know, you're interested in doing it, so you learn it. Okay. And I'll give you a perfect example of why I know without a doubt this is true. Because my daughter, so she's 7 now, but when she started kindergarten, we were virtual. So she was going to kindergarten on a computer. She's got ADHD. She just had no interest. And why would, 6 years old, who wants to sit on a computer and go reading flashcards? So she didn't ever pay attention. It was really hard. She didn't focus. She didn't really get any of the instruction. I never worked with her because I already know what I know about forcing it, and I wanted to let it happen in her own time. She's never been interested in reading books, so I never forced it, never did as much of a flashcard with this kid. So this is kindergarten. Come first grade, she goes into first grade, and she's a whole year ahead of her classmates in reading. She taught herself to read. I swear to God, I never did a single flashcard or lesson with her. You want to know why? What?
The word is locked.
The word?
Yeah.
It's because it's already locked.
But we came in late.
Well, okay, we'll figure it out. Let's do this first.
Okay.
She taught herself how to read. She's a whole year ahead of her classmates. She did it 100% on her own because she plays Roblox. On Roblox, messaging back and forth enhances, especially games like, she likes this Brookhaven game where it's role play. Well, how do you role play if you can't talk? So she started by voice texting. And then she would try to sound out what's sent back, and she'd ask me, like, what does this say, or how do you spell this? But for the most part, it was all on her own, and it took a good, 4 or 5 months before she really started to be able to read. But now, I mean, she can sound out words that my 15-year-old would have a hard time with. Now, he's autistic and he's delayed. It's nothing against him. It is what it is. He's at about a third grade reading level, and she's at about a second grade reading level, but her phonetic skills are so good because she just innately, naturally figured it out. Instead of me sitting down and say, okay, what does this letter sound make? What does that letter sound? Now put it together. What's a blend? Who cares? She wants to talk to her friends on Roblox so she figures it all out. She can't tell me the definition of a CK blend, but she can sound it out when she reads. Isn't that the whole point? My point is if I'd have sat down and forced her to learn to read, like you guys were sat down and forced to learn to read, some of you probably hate it. I guarantee there's people in this room that hate reading. Maybe you wouldn't have if you would have been forced and you would have been able to do it when you were interested in it. Anyway, I've gotten off on a tangent. This is something I can talk all day about this. But the point is he talks about how he's self-taught, how that's benefited him, and how that's something that he feels has really helped him. All right, let's read chapter 3. It starts on page 42. It says, when I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt. I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva, but my father thought it necessary for the completion of my education that I should be made acquainted with other customs than those of my own native country. So in other words, his parents have decided that now it's time for him to go to university. He's 17. They want him to learn some things outside of his own little world, which I get. I agree to that. That makes sense. Go learn something, a different part of the world, or a different type of learning, or a different type of people. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the day resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred, an omen, as if it were of my future misery. Okay, so remember, he had this really sheltered childhood. Now he's 17 and he says that the first really bad thing that's ever happened to him happened. Okay, so something really bad happened to him. He says that's as if it's an omen or foreshadowing, because remember, he ends up, with a tragic, miserable life. He says this might have been like a sign of things to come. Elizabeth caught the scarlet fever. Her illness was severe and she was in the greatest danger. During her illness, my many arguments had been urged to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that the life of her favorite was menaced, she could no longer control her anxiety. In other words, his mom knew that Elizabeth was really sick, and they were telling her, don't go by Elizabeth because Elizabeth is going to get you sick. And at first, mom listened. But then when she heard this person she loved so much was in so much danger, she had to go take care of her. She did attend to her on her sickbed. Her watchful attentions triumphed over the malignancy of distemper. Elizabeth was saved. But the consequences of this imprudence were fatal to her preserver. So in other words, her mom is going to get sick now. On the third day, my mother sickened. Her fever was accompanied by the most alarming symptoms, and the look of her medical attendants prognosticized the worst event. On her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of this best of women did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. My children, she said, my firmest hopes of future were placed in the prospects of your union. So she takes Elizabeth's hand and she takes Victor's hand and she says, the thing I've wanted most in my life was for you two to get married. That's her dying wish. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to my younger children. Alas, I regret that I'm taken from you, and happy and beloved as I have been, it is not hard to quit you all. But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world. She says, I'm going now, so it's on your father now to make sure that you guys get married. And Elizabeth, I need you to watch out for the younger kids in the family. And she's going in peace. She's still, even on her deathbed, she's got a smile and she's looking out for the others. She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feeling of those whose dearest ties are rent by that most irreparable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul, and the despair that is exhibited on the countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she whom we saw every day, whose very existence appeared a part of our own, can have departed forever. that the brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. So he says he's explaining something that only a person who's experienced this kind of loss can understand. Okay, if you've lost a parent, if you've lost a sibling that's taken care of you, if you've lost someone that's been in your life since you were young, you know what they're talking about. If you haven't, you can't. But the feeling of that, of kind of coming to terms with the fact that you're really not going to hear that person's voice again, that's the place he's in right now. These are the reflections of the first days, but when the lapse of time proves the reality of the evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. He says, but time proves it all. You know, over time you have no choice but to accept it, and then that grief really settles in. Yet from whom has not had that rude hand rent away some dear connection? And why should I describe a sorrow which all have felt and must feel? Okay, he says, why am I describing something that if you felt it, you know, and there are no words for it. If you haven't, there is no explanation that'll make sense. The time and length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity, and the smile that plays upon the lips, although it may be deemed a sacrilege, is not banished. My mother was dead, but we still had duties which we ought to perform. We must continue our course with the rest and learn to think ourselves fortunate while one remains the spoiler who has not seized. He says, at a certain point, you have to let your grief at least move to the side a little bit and continue on. He says that it feels wrong. You know, those first smiles, they feel wrong. It feels like you're doing something wrong, but he says, don't we have a duty as the ones who are still here to go ahead and be grateful and live our life? So it was almost kind of doing it for her, deciding he's going to move on. My departure from Ingolstadt, which had been deferred by these events, was now again determined upon. I obtained from my father a respite of some weeks. It appeared to me sacrilege so soon to leave the repose akin to death of the house of mourning and rush into the thick of life. I was new to sorrow, but it did not lessen the alarm of me. He says even though he had all this time, it still felt wrong to him to go back into life. And this is, if you've experienced this, any kind of real, like, very tragic grief or things where something very tragic happens, at first, everyone's kind of talking about it. Maybe you have a funeral or a wake, or, you know, it's kind of at the forefront. And then a week or two goes by and everyone goes back to normal. And you're still in that place of that extreme grief. And it's kind of like that point where you see, even though your world has fallen apart, the rest of the world just keeps going. So he's kind of in that place right now. But he says, I'm unwilling to quit the sight of those that remain to me. And above all, I desired to meet my sweet Elizabeth, in some degree, consoled. She indeed veiled her grief and strove to act the comfort to us all. She looked steadily on life and assumed its duties in courage and zeal. She devoted herself to those whom she had been taught to call her uncle and her cousins. Never was she so enchanting at this time when she recalled the sunshine of her smiles and spent them upon us. She forgot even her own regret in her endeavors to make us forget. So he said, if nothing else, he's going to do it for Elizabeth. Elizabeth is looking out for everyone else, even at the sacrifice of her own feelings, putting those to the side, looking out for everyone else. So he's thinking, if nothing else, I'm going to do this for her because she cares if I'm okay. If I'm okay, she'll be okay. So that's how he motivates himself. The day of my departure at length arrived. So he's getting ready now to leave for this school, and his friend Clerval spent the last evening with us. He had endeavored to persuade his father to permit him to accompany me and to become my fellow student, but in vain. His father was a narrow-minded traitor and saw idleness and ruin in the aspirations and ambitions of his son. Henry felt deeply the misfortune of being debarred from a liberal education. He said little, but when he spoke, I read in his kindling eye, in his animated glance, and restrained but a firm resolve not to be chained to the miserable details of commerce. So his friend wants to go away to university as well, but his friend's father is in the trades. He's more into like construction, things like that, as opposed to ideas of the mind, science. And his father doesn't want him doing that. And so while Victor gets to go off and live this kind of like a dream almost, like a really lucky existence, His friend has to stay and live in the real world, kind of. We sat late. We could not tear ourselves away from each other, nor persuade ourselves to say the word farewell. It was said, and we retired under the pretense of seeking repose, each fancying the other was deceived. But when the morning's dawn, I descended to the carriage which was to convey me away. They were all there. My father, again to bless me, Clerval, to press my hand once more, my Elizabeth to renew her entreaties that I would write often, and to bestow the last feminine attention on her playmate and friend. Okay, so they said they were tired, they went to sleep, even though they really weren't tired, but they needed Pat too. And then in the morning, he's getting ready to leave, and all the people are there. I threw myself onto the chaise that was to convey me away and indulged in the most melancholy reflection. So he got on the thing that was taking him away, and he just felt really sad. Melancholy is just this heavy sadness. I, who'd been surrounded by amicable companions, continually engaging in endeavors to bestow mutual pleasure, I was now alone. After this wonderful idealistic existence he's had, now all of a sudden he's alone. In the university, whether I was going, I must form my own friends and be my own protector. My life has hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic, and this had given me invincible repugnance to new countenances. So he said, I've been sheltered, I haven't had a lot of experiences, now I have to look out for myself. He says, I love my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. These were old familiar faces, but I believed myself unfitted for the company of strangers. He says, I know my own people accept me, but I'm not good enough to be accepted by the people at this university. I'm not worthy of that. Such were my reflections as I commenced my journey. But as I proceeded, my spirits and my hopes rose. I ardently desired the acquisition of knowledge. I had often, when at home, thought it hard to remain during my youth cooped up in one place, and had longed to enter the world and take my station among other human beings. Now my desires were complied with, and it would indeed have been folly to repent. He says, even though I feel sad, it's hard to move on from what I've just been through and get my mind on this. It's what I've always wanted. I've never been able to stop thinking about this, so I gotta go for it. Okay, that's where he's at on that. I had sufficient leisure for these and many other reflections during my journey to Ingolstadt, which was long and fatiguing. So it's a long trip. At length, the high white steeple of the town met my eyes. I alighted and was conducted to my solitary apartment to spend the evening as I pleased. The next morning, I delivered my letters of introduction and paid a visit to some of the principal professors. Chance, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, which asserted omnipotent sway over me from the moment I turned my reluctant steps from my father's door, led me first to M. Kremp, professor of natural philosophy. He was an uncouth man, but deeply embedded in the secrets of science. He asked me several questions concerning my progress in the different branches of science appertaining to natural philosophy. I replied carelessly and in part contempt, mentioning the names of my alchemists and the principal authors I have studied. Now, when he was studying when he was younger, we talked about how he was into the junk science. When he went to his father, and his father was trying to teach him about science, and his father asked him, what have you learned about science? And he pulls out this book. And the book is this Albert Magnus scientist book. And this is a real scientist who really existed, who really did controversial work. When he does this, he shows his father, and his father says, that's junk. That book is junk. You don't need to read that. Well, as a kid, and even as adults, although we like to pretend this isn't true, when someone tells you not to do something, what's the first thing you think of? Doing it, yeah, especially as a kid. You know, your parents tell you don't do something, you're like, wait, well, now I want to do it even more. And adults are like that too. It's, you know, we've learned to kind of curb that and to think it through. But when someone tells me don't do this, my first thought is, what would happen if I did? Okay, so that's what happened. His father said that to him, and then he got even more interested in that book. And he says, as he's relating this story, that had my father stopped and had an open and honest discussion with me about his concerns with that type of science, he said I might have changed my path. He said I might have gone to the more realistic and practical sciences. But that's not what happened. that one statement, that one sentence, okay? He had this wonderful childhood. And then this one sentence by his father, not that it's a bad thing, completely changes the direction that his life goes. And the point I'm trying to make is that relationships with people, although you get told a lot that they don't matter, like your studies matter more, you matter more, it's true, but relationships have a big influence on our life, very big influence, whether we want to know it or not, or whether we do know it or not. That is an example of a relationship that totally changed the course of his life. And it's okay that his father said that. I'm not making a judgment call. He said to the best of his ability what he knew. But let me tell you that what they call the junk science is the science on the fringe where they haven't proven the stuff yet. Okay? This is the big idea science, like quantum mechanics is what science is talking about now. Some people used to call that junk science because it sounds impossible. But that's what science is. Science is defining the impossible. I'll give you an example. His father thinks that scientist is crazy. The first person, so back in the day when they were doing surgeries, okay, they kept having people die in the surgery from infection. And this one guy did some research and says, I have an idea. If we use soap and water and wash our hands before we do surgery, it's gonna save lives. You wanna know, they called him crazy, and I even think he got locked up in a mental institution for a while because they said he was crazy because of this idea that washing hands would save lives. Okay, eventually, I think he was still alive. I know he got out, and I know he was able to go on and live his life, but they called him crazy. And eventually, obviously, it was proven that that is the number one most effective way, and so many people stopped dying. Okay, my point is that was considered junk science. That was considered fringe science. His father probably would have looked at that and said, washing hands, that's crazy talk. Okay? In order to find things like washing hands to save people from dying is very black and white. It can be proven, it makes sense, you can sort it all out, and it's a nice little pretty bow. This is an idea that there's no discussion about it, it's true. However, in order to get to that, you had to have the big thinker who was willing to think the impossible. They thought it was impossible that washing hands could help, but he was able to say, nope, that might not be impossible, okay? So that's the difference between these branches of science. All right, so he's telling this professor, he said, the next morning I delivered my letters, and the professor, he replies to him that, tells him that he's studied these alchemists. And the professor stared. Have you? He said, really spent your time studying such nonsense? I replied in the affirmative. Every minute, continued Mr. Kemp with warmth, every instant that you have wasted on these books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God, in what decent land have you lived where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies of which you have so greedily inhibited are 1,000 years old and musty as they are ancient? I little expected in this enlightened and scientific age to find a disciple of Albert Magnus and Pericles. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely. So he says what his father said, only with a lot more words like, this is crazy. You've just wasted your entire life learning about this. You need to start all over and learn the things I tell you to learn. So saying, he stepped aside and wrote down a list of several books treating of natural philosophy, which he desired me to procure, and dismissed me after mentioning that the beginning of the following week he intended to commence a course of lectures upon natural philosophy and its general relations, and that M. Walderman, a fellow professor, will lecture upon chemistry the alternate days that he omitted. So this guy that doesn't believe in his kind of science gives him a list of books that he wants him to study. This is the science I want you to learn, he tells him. And then he tells him about this other course that he's also going to go to. I returned home not disappointed, for I have said that I had long considered those authors useless, whom the professor regurgitated, but I returned not at all the more inclined to recur to these studies in any shape. M. Kemp was a little squat man with a gruff voice and a repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not predispose me in favor of his pursuits, and rather a too philosophical and connected a strain. Perhaps I have given an accent of the conclusions I have come to concerning them in my early years. As a child, I had not been content with the results promised by the modern professors of natural science, with a confusion of ideas only to be accounted for by my extreme youth and my want of a guide on such matters. I had retrod the steps of my knowledge along the inquirers for the dream of forgotten alchemists. Besides, I had contempt for the use of modern natural philosophy. So he says, as a child, I had no satisfaction based on the standard, already proven and known science. He said, I couldn't stop thinking about discoveries and inquiries and all these other things. It was very different when the masters of the science sought immortality and power. Such views, although fruitful, were grand, but now the scene changed. The ambition of the inquirer seemed to limit itself to the annihilation of these visions, on which my interest in science was chiefly founded. So he says, not only are they not addressing these ideas, it seems like they're actively trying to dissuade people from talking about them. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundaries for grandeur, for realities of little worth. So the guys basically tell him, if you want to come and study here and be successful, you need to let go of those big ideas. Lower your thoughts down a little bit. Think what we think. Look at what's already been done. Be practical. And I'm not saying it's wrong. The world needs practical people. The world needs people to bring us dreamers down and say, okay, keep your feet on the ground. But we also need dreamers, okay? Because if, like I said, if there wouldn't have been a dreamer, a person that was willing to think big, it would have never got to this point. Such were my reflections during the first 2 or 3 days of my residence at Ingolstadt, which were chiefly spent becoming acquainted with the localities and the principal residents in my new abode. But as the ensuing week commenced, I thought of the information which M. Kemp had given me concerning the lectures, and conceited fellow deliver sentences out of a pulpit. I recollected what he had said of M. Waldman, whom I had never seen and had hitherto been out of town. Standing up at a pulpit that's like a podium, he's talking about what's going to happen when he has to go and sit in a room and listen to someone stand up and talk. But partly from curiosity and partly from idleness, I went into the lecturing room, which M. Waldman entered shortly after. This professor was very unlike his colleague. He appeared about 50 years of age, but with an aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. A few gray hairs covered his temples, but those at the back of his head were nearly black. Okay, so he's a nice guy. He seems nice and pleasant. This person was short but remarkably erect, and his voice was the sweetest I had heard. He began his lecture by a recapitulation of the history of chemistry and the various improvements made by different men of learning, pronouncing with fervor the names of the most distinguished discoverers. He then took a cursory view of the present state of science and explained many of its elementary terms. After having made a few preparatory experiments, he concluded with a panegyric upon modern chemistry, the term which I shall never forget. The ancient teachers of this science, said he, promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little, and they know metals cannot be transmitted and that the elixir of life is chimera. But these philosophers whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt and their eyes pore over the microscope or crucible have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens and discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. So this teacher is saying that yes, chemistry is how we sort, we organize, we label, it makes sense, it's realistic. He says that was created and made able by the people who came before us, who tried to do the impossible, okay, who did make miracles happen. They ascend into the heavens and have discovered how blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers, and they can commit the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquakes, and even mock the invisible world with its shadows. Okay, so without these impossible big thinkers, none of this would be happening. Such were the professor's words. Rather, let me say, such the words of fate. Okay, this is where you need to pay attention for your assignment. Okay, this is what happens that kind of changes his course. Okay, he talks to the one professor tells him get rid of that junk science. This new professor tells him the junk science, quote unquote junk science, goes hand in hand with the basics of chemistry and things like that, and that changes things for him. Such were the professor's words. Rather, let me say the words of fate, announced to destroy me. Because remember, he ends up destroyed. As he went on, I felt my soul were grappling with a palpable enemy. One by one, the various keys were touched which formed the mechanism of my being. Chord after chord was sounded, and soon my mind was filled with only one thought, one conception, one purpose. So much has been done. Examine the soul, exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. More, far more will I achieve, treading the steps already marked. I will pioneer a new way, excuse me, explore unknown powers and untold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation. So meeting this guy has just inspired him even more. He wants to understand the meaning of creation. He wants to know the meaning of the universe, the meaning of life. What are we doing here? The very biggest question of all. That's the question he wants answered. I closed my eyes that night. My internal being was in a state of insurrection and turmoil, so he couldn't sleep. I felt that order would thence arise, but I had no power to produce it. By degrees, after moving the morning's dawn, sleep came. I awoke, and my yesternight's thoughts were as a dream. They only remained a resolution to return to my ancient studies and devote myself to a science for which I had believed myself to possess a natural talent. Okay, he wakes up more determined than ever to follow his passion and pursue the science that he thinks he has a talent at. And he's right, he does have a talent at it. He probably would have just been an average chemist, but this kind of scientist, he's extremely talented. On the same day, I paid M. Waldman a visit. His manners in private were even more mild and attractive than in public, for there was a certain dignity in his mien during his lecture, which in his own house was replaced with the greatest affability and kindness. I gave him pretty nearly the same account of my former pursuits, and I had given his fellow professor. He heard with attention and little narration concerning my studies and smiled at the names Cornelius, Apricot, and Pericles, but without the contempt that M. Kremp had exhibited. So he's bringing up this famous alchemist that everyone said was trash, and this guy knows him, but instead of having anger and contempt when he brings it up, he smiles. He says, these were men whose indefatigable zeal modern philosophers were indebted for most of the foundations of their knowledge. So he says the current scientist who says that this is junk, they really owe those people because that is the foundation of the science they currently practice. They had left to us an easier task, to give names and arrange in connected classifications with facts which they in great degree had been instruments of bringing to light. So they say, we did the hard part, now all they have to do is classify everything and put it in the right box. The labors of men of genius, however erroneously directed, scarcely ever fail in ultimately turning to the solid advantage of mankind. So these men who are genius, these people who are the big thinkers, who go after the big questions, who try to change the world, even though they don't necessarily always do exactly what they hoped, they scarcely ever fail in actually changing things. So they're going to benefit mankind one way or the other. I listened to his statement, which was delivered without any presumption or affection, and then added that his lecture had removed my prejudice against modern chemists. I expressed myself in measured terms with the modesty and deference due from a youth to his interior without letting escape. Inexperience in life would have made me ashamed. Any of the enthusiasm which has stimulated my intended labors. I requested his advice concerning the books I ought to pursue. Here's the key. Talking to this guy helped him get rid of the prejudices he had about chemistry. So he was into his branch of science. But if doesn't it stand to be true that if chemistry has benefits with the other science would have benefits with chemistry. So he was only seeing it from one side. Now he talks to this teacher and he realizes not all chemistry is bad, not all chemists are bad. Chemistry is the result of those big questions from before. That changes things for him. Because now going forward, he's going to be able to use both the other science and the chemistry. Okay, so that opens up new opportunities for him. I am happy, said M. Waldman, to have gained a disciple, and if your application equals your ability, I have no doubt of your success. Chemistry is the branch of natural philosophy in which the greatest improvements have been made, and it is on the account that I have made it a particular study, but at the same time, I have not neglected the other branches of science. A man would make but a very sorry chemist if he attended to that department of human knowledge alone. He says, I wouldn't even be that good of a chemist if the only thing I ever focused on was chemistry alone. If your wish is to become really a man of science and not merely a petty experimentalist, I should advise you to apply every branch, including mathematics. And just a little quick note about math. He's obviously not a math person. He's a big picture, not the details. However, even in math, now I'm not a math person. I'm a big picture person. But I know that, so the Pythagorean theorem is, the right angle, it's 90 degrees. And you can use the Pythagorean theorem to figure out the sides of angles. If it's a right triangle, you can do that here, you can do that with the wall and the angle here. But it also works the same a million miles away in space. That seems impossible. The math here on the ground that we use today that really affects everything, someone had to be a big thinker in order to even test the theory that this could work out in the universe, besides just being here. Okay, so the big picture and the details, they really do both go together. He then took me into his laboratory and explained to me the uses of his various machines, instructing me as to what I ought to procure and promising me the use of his own when I should have advanced far enough in the science not to derange their mechanism. He also gave me the list of books which I had requested, and I took my leave. Thus ended a day memorable to me, and it decided my future destiny. So he's got a laboratory, he's going to let him play with the toys and the machines in his laboratory once he knows he won't break them. But at the end of this, he says his meeting with that one professor changed his destiny going forward. Okay? It gave him insight that there was also value to be had in the standard traditional sciences like chemistry. Okay? That could do a lot of things going forward. That could open up his possibilities to all different types of things he could do. I reiterate that because that's your assignment for today. Okay, it's in Canvas. I'll have to make sure it's posted for you guys. You're going to write a paragraph about what changed his destiny, what changed his fate. This whole last page that we read, you can use anything off of there. You can use your own words. There's not one correct right answer. Okay, just tell me what you think. You guys can work together if you want to, but you don't have to. You guys have questions? Okay.